Didn't see what he was yelling at. I didn't see the ambulance coming, but I remembered him yelling. That was the last thing I heard from him.
Landon Whitley's story is incredible as he came back from the brink of death with a message from Jesus, and it's nothing short of chilling. Each time he was thought to be gone, he returned with a warning. He's not alone. Other kids and a young man also had similar experiences, claiming they saw Jesus when they nearly died. What did they see? And why did they need to die to understand it? Let us dive into the eerie messages these brave souls were given to share that will change the world. The car crash that changed everything. Landon Whitley was just 8 years old when something amazing happened to him for the first time. It was a regular Sunday in 1997, and Landon was in the car with his parents, Julie and Andy, after church. They were driving home in their Pontiac when suddenly their day turned tragic. An ambulance ran into their car right where Landon's dad, Andy, was sitting. Andy died right there, but emergency workers managed to quickly help Julie out of the wrecked car. At first, they didn't even realize Landon was there because the car was so badly damaged. Landon was hidden behind his dad, and it took a while for the rescuers to find him. They first saw his shoe and then found him. When they got him out, he wasn't breathing, but they worked fast to help him breathe again. This was just the beginning of a tough time for Landon. He was brought back to life and immediately flown to the hospital in a life flight helicopter. Landon was in terrible shape, and that day, he stopped breathing 2 more times. Each time, the doctors and nurses managed to bring him back. The doctors were worried, though. They told his mom, Julie, that even if Landon survived, he might have severe brain damage and need constant care, similar to a very young child. Julie was heartbroken but hoped for Landon's recovery no matter the outcome. During this extremely hard time, Julie also had to deal with losing her husband. She felt like she had been left alone and didn't understand why such a terrible thing had happened to them. She was upset and questioned why they hadn't been protected from such a tragedy. Even though she was angry and confused, Julie never stopped praying. She kept asking God to let Landon survive, holding on to her faith as best as she could. Landon had hurt his head badly in the accident and was in a coma for 2 weeks. During that time, he was hooked up to many machines that kept him alive, while his mom, Julie, stayed by his side, praying for him to wake up. The doctors didn't have much hope, but Julie didn't give up on her prayers. Then, something incredible happened. Landon woke up with no brain damage at all, which was a huge surprise to everyone. Julie was thrilled, but she knew she had to face a difficult conversation. She had to tell Landon that his dad had passed away. When she asked Landon if he knew where his dad was, Landon said he had seen him in heaven. He also mentioned seeing 2 other children there, which shocked Julie because she had never told Landon about her 2 miscarriages. Landon's story is nothing less than a miracle. He vividly remembers the crash, the coma, and his experiences in heaven where he saw his dad and other loved ones who had passed away before. Julie is forever thankful that her son survived and healed, believing that their strong faith and constant prayers got them through the darkest times. Landon even remembered seeing 2 children in heaven who he knew were his siblings, even though Julie had never mentioned them to him before. Each time Landon came back to life, he had been to heaven, where he received messages and visions. During his 3rd visit, he met Jesus, who gave him a scary message and an important mission. Jesus told him to go back to earth, live as a good Christian, and share the news of his existence with others. Landon felt like he had been shown just a few parts of a bigger story and knew he had a special task to complete. Years later, in 2019, Landon and his mom started sharing their experience with others who were also struggling with loss. They joined a program called Grief Share, where they could tell their story and support others. Julie now believes that even though her husband wasn't saved that day, they were still being looked after in some way, and they were living out a plan meant for them. They encourage others not to get stuck in their sadness or anger, but to keep believing and hope for better days. As Landon was beginning to understand his amazing experiences, another young person was about to have a similar encounter, seeing the other side. Landon wants everyone to know that Jesus is real, that heaven is a real place, and that angels exist. He hopes people will follow the teachings of Jesus and the Bible and realize that life can improve. Landon's unique experiences have given him a special view on life, and he is eager to share that with others. He is a living proof of God's love and grace, and he inspires others to hold on to their faith too. Julie put their experiences into a book called Faith Has Its Reasons, where she talks about how their difficult times brought them and others closer to God. Seeing Landon talk about Jesus and the heaven he saw feels like a huge blessing to her. Despite the physical challenges and changes from the accident, like having many metal plates in his head, a rebuilt nose, and limited sight in one eye, Landon leads a relatively normal life. He is committed to his mission of spreading Jesus' message, confident in his faith, and wants to show everyone that the spiritual things he talks about are very real. Landon is an inspiration, showing that strong faith can bring incredible strength and hope. Landon Whitley is not the only kid who has claimed to have had an extraordinary encounter with Jesus after coming close to death. Another young man, Zach Clements, who played football at his high school, also went through a life-changing event. During a physical education class, Zach suddenly lost all his strength and collapsed on the ground. His heart had stopped, and for 20 minutes, he was technically dead. The doctors later figured out he had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. His mom was called to the scene, and Zach was urgently flown to a children's hospital. In what seemed like a lost cause, just when the medical team was about to declare him dead, they found a pulse. Zach woke up several days later and began to recover in what many would call a miraculous way. He talked openly about his experience of dying, seeing Jesus, and then coming back to life. He remembered everything clearly from those crucial moments without oxygen. Despite the seriousness of his condition, Zach's resilience, humor, and determination to share his story and spread the word of God played a big part in his recovery. Just like Landon and Zach, a young girl named Mia also had a profound experience. Back in October 2012, Melissa Harris and her husband, Mike, decided to take a break and went hiking with their kids in Wayne National Forest in Ohio. On the last day of their trip, a terrible accident happened. Mike was carrying Mia on a trail when a large tree branch fell from 60 feet above and hit Mia directly on the head. Melissa heard Mike scream in panic, and when she took Mia into her arms, she felt that Mia was lifeless.
It was just this awful scream. I mean, it wasn't like a physical scream. It was like from the depths of her soul.
It seemed like Mia was gone. Melissa described the feeling as holding something that felt empty. The silence was broken by Mia's scream, which was horrifying, yet a sign that she was still alive. The situation was dire. Mike rushed to find cell service to call for help, while Melissa held Mia, feeling overwhelmed by the gravity of her daughter's injuries. She touched Mia's head and could tell that it was severely damaged. Melissa was distraught, thinking not about if, but when they might lose Mia. Remembering a story from the Bible where a woman was healed just by touching Jesus' robe, Melissa drew strength from her faith. She believed strongly that if Jesus' power could heal that woman, it could also save Mia. Melissa prayed intensely, repeatedly asking God to heal her daughter as she laid her hands on Mia, hoping for a miracle. The scene was chaotic and filled with desperation. Melissa was crying and praying, clutching Mia and begging for her daughter's life. The memory of Mia's lifeless body and her terrifying scream was something Melissa knew she would never forget. She couldn't believe this was happening to their family. Despite feeling powerless and hopeless, Melissa's faith remained strong. She remembered another Bible verse where Jesus acknowledged a woman's faith as the reason for her healing. This boosted Melissa's confidence that Jesus could also heal Mia. While Landon's story was giving hope to many, a family in Ohio was about to go through a tough test of their faith. A child's amazing recovery. Finally, help arrived. First responders quickly took Mia to a nearby hospital, where it was confirmed that she had suffered a traumatic brain injury, along with a fractured skull and internal bleeding around her brain. Mike followed in his car, but stopped along the way to call their church, asking everyone to pray for Mia. The prayers spread quickly through their church community, both locally and internationally. with people all over the world praying for Mia. She was then put into a medically induced coma and transferred to Nationwide Children's Hospital. Mike and Melissa were left wondering if Mia would wake up the next morning. Surprisingly, when Mia was brought out of her coma, she immediately showed signs of awareness. She even mentioned needing a diaper change, which was a relieving sign for Mike that Mia was still with them and might be okay. Although she initially showed signs of paralysis on her left side, Mia overcame these challenges within 3 days. She later underwent surgery to repair her skull and the tear in the membrane around her brain. Remarkably, Mia recovered fully, regaining all cognitive functions and her bubbly personality. It was as though the accident had never affected her. A few months after the accident, Mia told her dad about a dream where Jesus had brought her home. This convinced Mike and Melissa that God had indeed intervened in their daughter's recovery. They felt incredibly thankful for the opportunity to continue raising Mia, believing that their prayers had been answered. Mia made a complete recovery, and her parents were forever grateful for the miracle they had witnessed. Bobby Sosa's story adds another unique perspective. Starting as a police officer in New Jersey at 19, Bobby was exposed to some harsh realities early on. He shared his story on YouTube, discussing how he initially resented God after the death of his grandmother, who had raised him. After leaving the police force to start a career in finance at 28, Bobby met his future wife, a devout Christian, which gradually influenced his views. Despite his initial reluctance and ongoing bitterness over losing his grandparents, Bobby's perspective shifted over time. He eventually embraced the faith that he once dismissed, finding a new sense of peace and purpose in his life. On the night of March 23, 2020, something happened to Bobby Sosa that completely turned his world upside down. He went to sleep feeling just fine, but woke up in the middle of the night gasping for air, his chest feeling like it was being crushed. Using the quick thinking he learned as a police officer, Bobby curled up into a tight ball, trying to make it easier for himself to breathe. What he didn't know was that his wife, seeing him struggle, had already called 911 in a panic. Before he knew it, his house was swarming with paramedics and police officers ready to help. One police officer in particular made a big difference that night. Even though Bobby felt too weak and scared to get up, the officer gently encouraged him, offering a helping hand. With a bit of persuasion, Bobby managed to stand, though he barely remembers that part. His wife later told him that he had turned completely blue and wasn't responding at all before the officer got there. She described how he seemed to be lifted up by someone as soon as he stood, after which he felt like he was floating in a dark, empty space where he couldn't see or hear anything. Back in the real world, even though he seemed to be somewhere far away, Bobby could still talk to his wife. He told her he was very tired and said sorry for everything that was happening. But soon, his eyes rolled back, and he passed out again. The paramedics quickly got him into an ambulance where his heart stopped. Bobby was dead for over 40 minutes before they could get his heart working again and rushed him to the hospital, where he was declared clinically dead on arrival. During this critical time, his wife, who used to work as an EMT, was only allowed to see him for 5 minutes every hour because of strict hospital rules. After Mia's incredible recovery, the idea of divine help continued, this time with a former police officer in New Jersey who would have an extraordinary experience. A second chance at life. Things looked really bad, and at one point, the doctors told Bobby's wife to prepare for the worst. But just then, their spiritual mentor told her not to give up hope. Instead, he advised her to go into Bobby's room and pray with all her heart. Taking this advice to heart, she prayed loudly and passionately, which seemed to cause a shift in their luck. Suddenly, a spot opened up in the intensive care unit, and Bobby was quickly moved there, though his wife didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. While all this was happening, Bobby had a completely different experience. He felt like he was floating in a void, cut off from the world. Then, out of nowhere, a figure that Bobby recognized as Jesus appeared by his side. Jesus came close and held Bobby in a warm, comforting way, like during a dance at a wedding. This moment was incredibly moving for Bobby, and he began to apologize, overwhelmed by the encounter. Also, during this strange experience, Bobby saw another familiar face, his old friend Mark, who had been a police officer and had passed away. They shared a special moment, reassuring each other that Bobby would look after Mark's wife, something he had promised before Mark died. Their conversation felt like a warm reunion, focusing on the life they shared, not on where they were or what was happening. When Bobby woke up in the ICU 9 days later, he was very confused. He didn't remember anything about his near-death experience. The ICU was noisy and full of activity, which scared him a lot. Nobody was explaining what was going on, which made him feel even more vulnerable. The first person he spoke to was a man in protective gear who knew his name but wouldn't answer his questions. Feeling defensive and scared, Bobby didn't want anyone touching him. He thought maybe he had caught COVID-19 as he saw bits about it on the TV, though tests later showed he hadn't. Bobby's mind was a whirl of paranoia, thinking the hospital staff might be out to harm him or worse. He refused to eat or sleep, scared he might be poisoned. This went on until one night, a nurse visited, and a man in lime green scrubs came in. This man approached Bobby with a kindness that stood out. At first, Bobby was defensive, but then the man introduced himself as a prayer warrior, sent by Bobby's wife. This calmed Bobby down a lot, and he started to accept the help being offered. 2 weeks later, Bobby had recovered enough to understand what had happened. He remembered his repeated brushes with death and shared the whole story with his wife, who was amazed. She tried to find this strange man, Kendrick, but there was no record of him at the hospital. Only later did she realize that her prayers might have been answered in a very direct way, with Kendrick being a sort of answer to her prayers for Bobby to meet Jesus himself. Bobby Sosa's close call with death taught him an incredibly important lesson. God is real, and his comforting presence becomes very apparent when we need it the most. Bobby shared this profound realization in a video, where he talked about a book by a neurologist who had a similar near-death experience and also encountered Jesus. This book, along with his own experience, helped Bobby firmly believe that there's a real, divine presence that shows up at critical times and that death isn't the end, but a transition to a different existence. According to Bobby, when we make this transition, we leave behind all the negative emotions like worry, doubt, fear, pain, and suffering. What replaces them is peace and a love so deep and overwhelming that it's hard to put into words. Bobby felt this love firsthand when he crossed over and then came back to life. A few weeks after coming back from his near-death experience, Bobby told his wife that the idea of dying didn't scare him anymore because the love he felt was so pure and beautiful. He explained that understanding what's on the other side removes the fear of the unknown. Is Landon's experience a real divine encounter or just the power of the mind? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.